welcome to episode 70 of React Native Radio. I'm your host, Nader Dabbit. Today on our panel, we have Peter Pikarczyk.
Hey, everybody.
And our special guest today is Nikolas Burk. And Nikolas Burk works with GraphCool, and we're really happy to have him on the show. Nikolas, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hey, Nader. Hey, Peter. Hey from Berlin.
Hello from San Francisco.
Hello from
Chicago, yeah.
Awesome.
So, can you give us a quick, we're going to go and I would like to get an intro to GraphCool in just a second, but before we do that, can you kind of give us an intro about yourself, how you got into programming and how you ended up at GraphCool?
All right, sure. So I actually only started programming at university. So I was maybe around like 19 or 20 years old. And at university, I studied management of information systems. It wasn't too technical, but we had some portion of programming in there that was mostly Java programming, actually. But very quickly into my studies, I realized that the technical parts of my study were much more interesting to me than the business part. So I kind of started neglecting the business part and really focused on programming in general. And also started to do a lot of side projects. I also got jobs. I was actually mostly working as a native mobile developer then, mostly doing Objective-C and then later on Swift. So I was mainly working on the Apple platforms. And that was how I spent most of my time actually that I was spending programming was by building apps. I was working for the big German software company SAP and also for some smaller companies, for startups, also did some freelance work and eventually ended up joining GraphCool this year. And there I'm basically working as a developer, but also taking somewhat care of developer relations. So I'm the guy who produces most of our examples and tutorials, blog posts, and all of that kind of stuff. I'm speaking at conferences, hosting workshops. So I'm really trying to teach people how they can use GraphQL and how they can take advantage of all the nice features that it offers.
Very cool. I really like the idea of teaching because I've been doing that quite a bit myself. So that's pretty cool. And it sounds like a pretty fun position.
Yeah, so the really cool part about this job is actually that it mainly consists in me learning a new thing, be it a new GraphQL feature that was released or maybe something that we built, like a new platform feature of GraphCool. But it usually is the same approach that I first have to learn this thing myself. And then in the next step, I'll actually go ahead and write about it and produce a small sample project or something like this. And then eventually I might be giving a talk at a local meetup or at a conference about it. So it's always this learning for myself and then trying to teach other people how they can achieve the same kind of experience.
So what attracted you to GraphCool and GraphQL, the technology in general?
So the way how I ended up at GraphCool was actually kind of incidental, as I had a friend who was one of their first employees. So at the moment, we're actually just a team of five people who are working full time. That includes the two founders, then my friend who is essentially building the whole front end. Then we've got one person for customer success who is responding to all customer requests on Slack and all the other channels that customers are contacting us on. And then it's me, and I'm responsible for the content. And I basically ended up working there because my friend who's working on the front end at GraphCool, he just asked me if I wanted to join the team. And at that point, they were planning to start producing more content all around GraphQL. So it seemed like a good fit with my ambition and with my passion for learning and sharing my knowledge. That was something that I have always enjoyed doing. So it was kind of a natural fit. And that's how I ended up there.
That's incredible. It's funny to hear or it's awesome to hear the story of GraphCool grow, especially now that I use it on a daily basis, right? I'm hanging out in that GraphCool chat all day long,
Oh, wow. Okay, I didn't even know that. You got to say hi then in our Slack.
Oh, yeah. Nylan at this point knows me very, very well because I'm all
Yeah, exactly. He's exactly that customer success person I was talking about, and everybody knows him. We hosted the GraphQL Europe conference 2 or 3 months ago, and most of the people there had already used GraphCool, and everybody knows Nilan as our customer success person, as the point of contact. And it's actually really interesting because as he's so much in touch with our customers, he really has a lot of insight around all the different parts of our platform. He really knows all the flaws inside and out. So he's a really, really technical person, very knowledgeable about our platform. And like he's the go-to person when I have a problem with like an example project. I'm really happy that I have him sitting right next to me because I can just ask him. He has just the best debugging skills when it comes to like debugging any issue with GraphCool.
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, anything that comes up, he's quick to respond. He's quick to answer. It's actually made my GraphCool experience so much easier because I'm not only learning GraphCool, I'm learning a lot of like tips and tricks that I'd never learned,
Awesome.
about GraphQL. So it's been definitely like a great learning experience overall, just hanging out in that Slack.
Cool. Yeah, very nice.
So for people that are listening that maybe haven't used GraphCool, can you kind of give us a quick elevator pitch or kind of introduction to what GraphCool is?
GraphCool essentially is what today you would probably call a backend as a service. We essentially take the work off of your shoulders that you would have if you were to start out with a new project, and you know that for the front end you want to build a mobile app with React Native, but somehow you also need a server component where you have a database that stores your data and then an API that allows you on the API. This is usually the kind of work that you would have to do on the server side yourself. And when you're doing that, then you have to decide like on a framework, what kind of technologies you want to use and such. And we just completely eliminate that part for you. And we're taking care of all the like nitty gritty that you would otherwise have to do on the back end. And on top of that, we are providing not only the server infrastructure, but we're also providing you with a nice GraphQL API that allows your clients to really access the data in a really like nice and convenient way, rather than having to deal with the issues and inefficiencies that you would get when working with like REST APIs.
So how was GraphCool built like on the back end? Just out of curiosity, like what is going on behind the scenes, I guess, with the actual back end, I guess you would say?
Right. So it's a really good question. So actually our two founders, they started out building the whole platform in Node. And that was maybe 1.5 years ago. So last year in February, they started building this platform in Node. But actually, after a couple of months, they realized that the kind of platform that they wanted to build wouldn't really be able to like scale well if they continue building it in Node, because they saw as they were adding new features that like different parts of the platform were already breaking, and Node just wasn't the right fit for the kind of platform that they wanted to build. So at that point, they had to make a really like impactful decision. And at that point, that was that they were going to switch the whole backend to Scala. And I think there are two major reasons for this. So Scala is really a great language for like larger and large scale applications in general, as it's strongly typed. It makes functional programming techniques really easy to achieve. But then the second point why they choose Scala was also that one of the only GraphQL implementations back at that point was actually in Scala, and that's called Sangria. And these are essentially the two reasons why they decided to go with Scala back then. The fact that Scala is just a really nice language for these kind of purposes. But then on the other hand, it also provided the GraphQL like framework that they needed to get started in the first place.
Oh, very interesting. So they went with Scala. That's pretty cool to know. So is I guess is the database that's kind of powering all this? What kind of database is that? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, so that is a SQL database and runs on AWS Aurora. So that is kind of the infrastructure that we provide you with. When you create your GraphCool project, the infrastructure that we'll spin up is an AWS Aurora database, and then we kind of generate the GraphQL API based on the data model that you provide in the first place when you create your project. And we essentially give you like all the capabilities that you would want for your API. And that's mostly like this CRUD-style API for your model types, essentially.
So that's interesting that Node wasn't able to handle the capabilities, right? Like, I feel like these days people go with like a language and just like, oh yeah, it'll just work, right? Like it's interesting to me that they were able to identify that so early on and pivot, to another type of language and even paradigm, right? Because Scala is much more on the functional end, right? So
Yes. So guess you could have tried to work your way around these issues that they saw with Node and JavaScript on the back end by using like additional tools like Flow or TypeScript that would actually like give you at least the strongly typed code that you would want. And you don't want to write like unit tests to just validate if a certain object actually adheres to the structure that you expect it to have. You don't want to write a unit test for this, but you actually want like a compiler to catch these kinds of issues for you. So you could use TypeScript or Flow to get that kind of functionality. But I think in the end, it was still that Scala is just a more like stable and safer choice to build this kind of a platform that you really want to maintain for at least a decade. Like you really want to have a product that is able to sustain for a long time. And for these kinds of projects, I think statically typed languages are just still more appropriate as they have this safety already baked into the core. And with Node and JavaScript, you would have to like use tools to get that kind of safety in the first place. But why use a tool that doesn't provide the safety inside the core when you can actually use that kind of language for the project that you want to build? So I think here it's indeed the better choice to go with that from the very beginning.
So obviously GraphCool is kind of built around the GraphQL technology, and it's kind of placing what you might call like a bet that this technology is going to continue to grow and it's going to be popular and it's going to be, you know, a sustainable technology. What do you think about GraphQL and kind of how the adoption has been and kind of what you're seeing as far as adoption in the general ecosystem?
So seeing that GraphQL is really only like 2 years old, so it's not even 2 years ago that Facebook released the official GraphQL specification, I think the technology itself has already seen like a tremendous adoption, and the community that has evolved around it is also just like completely blowing my mind. I mean, we held the GraphQL Europe conference in May this year, or in April actually, and we had 300 attendees, but we easily could have had like 400, 500. And the GraphQL Summit conference that is in San Francisco, actually this year in October, I think, last year also had around 300 attendees, and I think that they're almost going to double it this year. So the community and the interest of the developer community is really, really high in this new technology. And I think that this is just natural because GraphQL is the kind of API technology that just makes a lot more sense if you compare it to what we're using today. That's mostly REST. So it just offers a lot of benefits that you don't get with regular REST APIs. So it's kind of a logical choice for me that it sees so much adoption already. Like major tech companies have already started using it in production. GitHub has released their newest version of their API as a GraphQL API. And there are like a lot more examples. For example, Shopify completely switched over their API to a GraphQL API. Recently, Yelp announced their GraphQL API. So really big companies are actually also making that bet. And I think they are making that in a very rightfully, because in 10 years, I don't think that we'll talk a lot about REST APIs anymore. It's just that we are going to be using GraphQL as the new API standard, as it just makes or has a lot of advantages that I think we're going to speak about in the next half an hour, hopefully.
So let's talk about some of those advantages. Anyway, for me, it was being able to move quickly in terms of having nothing and moving to something in a short matter of time, right? So like usually I would set up like Postgres or MongoDB. I would set up like an API using like Happy or, you know, like whatever, or like Express or whatever. And then I would take the time to put together the data models, right? You know, like deal with like SQL, writing SQL queries, and then writing the API endpoints for those queries, and then seeing if I can optimize those queries, right? That was a lot of time, right? And a lot of time you spend connecting your models together, or, you know, like trying to figure out the best way to, you know, like get something, you know, without it being total crap and, you know, like a throwaway code, right? While like features. So that was the big selling point for me.
So I do think that we have to make a distinction here, because the advantages that you just iterated on, they are essentially advantages that you get from using GraphCool. So kind of the whole service, and you don't have to take care of the backend at all anymore. But if we're just talking about GraphQL, I mean, you don't have to use GraphCool in order to use GraphQL, right? And GraphQL itself really is only a specification. So it's nothing but a long document that describes in detail how a GraphQL server actually has to behave. And this means essentially that it defines what the shape and the structure of a request is that a GraphQL server can accept, and what the response format for that request is going to look like. It doesn't specify, though, how the GraphQL server is going to achieve that response format. So this is completely up to the actual implementation in the end, as to like figure out how the actual implementation works and how the GraphQL server processes the request and will package up the response. But what we can already say as to what are the advantages for using GraphQL compared to REST is that the biggest and most canonical advantage is just that you can get exactly the data that you're asking for. And it's actually funny that when I'm talking to like non-technical friends and I'm trying to explain to them what I'm doing now in this new job at GraphCool and why GraphQL is such a compelling technology, and I try to explain to them, well, you know, the cool thing about GraphQL is that an application can ask for precisely the data that it needs. And at that moment, they look at me and they say, well, that sounds pretty logical. Why would it be different? And then I have to go and explain to them the concept of REST APIs, where you have the concept of an endpoint, and that endpoint is going to return a specific resource. And no matter if the information for a specific resource, like let's say we have this user object, and all the information that we get from the /users endpoint is actually the name and then the birthday and the location of the user, maybe the home address and billing details and stuff like this. This is all information that we get from the /users endpoint. But we actually, at this point in time, only want to render a profile screen for the user where we actually only need the first name. We don't need anything else. But the only way to get this information is by hitting the user's endpoint in the REST API, which is also going to download all this additional information that's not really required in the app at this point in time. And this is actually called overfetching, and means that we are downloading data that is not actually required inside the application. And this is not very desirable, as we're putting weight on the user's data plan without having any benefit for them, right? We're just downloading data that's completely unnecessary. So that's the problem of overfetching. But this can also go into the other direction. So we also sometimes deal with a situation where, let's say you have like an Instagram application and you have a feed with a number of posts, and each post has an image URL and a title that you're downloading when you're hitting the /posts endpoint in your REST API. But then what happens is that you might also want to display the profile picture of the author. So this is actually information that is, again, stored at the user's endpoint. So you kind of would have to like first send a request to the /posts endpoint that might give you the author ID of each post. But then you would have to send one additional request for each post so that you can also get the profile picture of the author. So you're sending a lot of different requests to get this kind of information. And so you are not able to get all the information that you need with only one request. You actually have to send multiple requests to get the right information. And this is, again, is also not desirable. And this is where GraphQL hits exactly the sweet spot, in that it lets the client decide what data is actually needed. This is specified in what's called a query. So the client essentially writes a query, sends over that query to the GraphQL server. And like here is a really important distinction that you have to make, is that with a REST API, you usually have a number of different endpoints that return fixed data structures. With a GraphQL API, on the other hand, you only have one single endpoint, and you also usually don't send GET requests to that endpoint, but instead you're sending a POST request so that you have more like space where you can put more information. And in this particular case, this is going to be the query, which you put in the body of the POST request. So then the server can actually process the query and fetch the required data, package it up, and return it to the client. So it's just it's actually very, very natural if you think about it, what GraphQL allows you to do. But unfortunately, it just wasn't able to do that in the past with REST APIs, at least not when you were really implementing a strict specification of REST. Of course, there are ways how you can get closer to the same benefits that you get also with GraphQL. So if you look at Swagger, for example, Swagger is a nice approach to build a system around REST to actually enable some of the advantages that you get with GraphQL out of the box. But I would still argue that the problem with REST is just that it doesn't give you the right abstraction for the kind of applications that we want to build today. And if you run into limitations with REST, what you have to do is you have to build systems around it so that you get this kind of flexibility. Whereas with GraphQL, you've got this flexibility already in the core of the system that you're using for your API. So I would argue that their GraphQL is just the better choice for an abstraction that you want to have when you're building an API.
I think that's a very, very good explanation of everything that GraphQL has to offer. I know we've kind of mentioned mobile, but it seems like this has become more of a, I guess fetching these large data sets has become more of a problem with mobile. And it's been more of a, GraphQL has been more of a good solution, I guess, for mobile because we're working with slow networks in certain parts of the world. And you want to kind of have the fastest request and response time. And with GraphQL, you can fetch tiny, tiny amounts of data and get everything you need. And as opposed to what we've been kind of used to with REST, where we get these large sets of data because we can't have our backend return every little tiny thing that we need, through REST. That kind of seems like a good solution. What do you think about how GraphQL, GraphCool kind of goes along with the emergence of the mobile platform?
Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting point. Like if you look at the history of GraphQL, Facebook actually developed it for their mobile apps. And the reason why they did this is that they were becoming active in markets where it was just normal to have a very, very bad network connection. And the kind of devices that the users are using over there, if you think about like the emerging markets, then you have like a lot of Android devices, very low powered Android devices and very bad network conditions. So you just cannot allow yourself to like have this overhead of talking to maybe 10 different REST endpoints just to get the data that you need for one specific screen. You have to be more efficient in the area of data transfer. And so this was kind of the original motivation for Facebook to build GraphQL in the first place. And they did a really good job, but they started out only using it in their native mobile applications, actually. So I can recommend a talk that was given at GraphQL Europe by Dan Schaefer, who essentially worked with the GraphQL team from the very beginning. And he gave a couple of insights as to how GraphQL evolved inside of Facebook and how it got how it was invented for mobile, but then eventually also was adopted in their web teams. And then when they actually open sourced it, because they always talked about it in the context of like React and web technologies, like it took a really long time, I think, for the community to understand that GraphQL is actually a technology that has or that can be used with all kinds of technologies and frameworks around it. It's just like a layer for an API. It's not a database technology, despite sharing the same suffix with SQL. It's just like a query language for APIs. And it doesn't matter in which programming language your API is actually implemented. It doesn't matter what the clients look like that are going to access the API. It's just like a specification for how a server can or should expose its data to various clients. So it took a while, I think, especially for mobile developers, to understand that this is even a thing that they should be looking into. And I think that especially in the native developer communities yet, this is still something that most native developers don't really care about, as I think I perceive the native development community a bit more as a bubble than the web communities, where you're also looking into sorts of different kind of framework. So if you're a React developer, you usually also know that there is Vue and Angular and that kind of stuff, and you maybe have a rough idea of how they work. But I think if you're active in the native space, and I say that as having a mobile development background myself, is you're really, really focused on the platform that you're actually developing for, and you don't care so much what's happening outside of that, especially if it's in the server-side space. So I think it'll still take a while and a lot of education until like mobile developers also understand that GraphQL is definitely a technology for them.
You know, you're so right about that. I feel like GraphQL seems to be really a hot topic in our little world, our little like bubble of React developers. And I feel like it's not. I'm working with a lot of native developers now with React Native training that are picking up React Native, and most of them have maybe either not heard of GraphQL, or it just doesn't kind of correlate with using GraphQL or GraphCool with or these type of technologies with native. So do you think that's like a community issue or like a branding issue, or what do you think it is? And I know that GraphQL is like an open source technology. They're not really worried about like getting it popular. They just want it to work good for their, for people want it to work well for their own use cases. And it's not really something that probably people are going to spend a lot of time worrying about. But it doesn't hurt if a lot of other, spaces pick this up, because the more people using it, the better, right? So like, what do you feel like about ways to kind of get, people at least taking a look at it more seriously in the more traditional native space?
So I feel like that, especially in like the traditional native space, it's also a major question of tooling. Like in the web world, we already have like two very strong GraphQL clients at the moment, and that's Relay, which is the GraphQL client library that's essentially developed by Facebook as well and was open source alongside GraphQL almost 2 years ago. So we've got Relay, and then we've got the second GraphQL client that's called Apollo. And these are like the big GraphQL clients on the web. So if you want to start out with GraphQL on the web, you essentially already have everything you need. You've got this choice already between powerful GraphQL clients, and to build your server, you're already part of the web community. So you have somewhat more familiarity in the first place with what a server actually is and how to build one. So I think the entry barrier for web developers is a lot lower than for native mobile developers, who usually just care about like the app that they are building. And if they need some server storage solution, then they'll be appealed to use like these backend as a service things like Firebase or Parse back in the day. But they don't have a huge choice yet of GraphQL clients, for example. And this is already changing. Like Apollo is actually making an effort to build GraphQL client libraries for all major development platforms, and that also includes like the native ones. But the versions that they have released so far, they are still pretty early, and I don't think that they have seen too much adoption just yet. So it's still in the native developer space, it's still somewhat of an unknown topic, I would argue. And as soon as the tooling advances there, I think we'll see also more adoption, because then it gets easier, and it's also easier to actually take advantage of the benefits that GraphQL provides. Maybe we should talk a second about like what a GraphQL client actually is, and why you should be using one. As like the way how you usually work with REST APIs is that when you have a REST API and you have an application that needs to access data, you just like usually construct your HTTP request yourself. You say, what is the URL that this has to go to? The URL might include some parameters, and then you send like a GET request to the API. Then the response comes back, and you have to take care of like parsing the response, potentially like caching the data that you retrieve from there, and then eventually you can display the data in the UI. But there is a lot of overhead involved in this data fetching process until the data actually ends up in your UI. And what's really nice about GraphQL that it enables this declarative data fetching approach, where like in the center of your data fetching logic should actually only be the query, so a declarative specification of data that you need on the client side that you will send over to the server. And you don't want to deal with these lower level networking details anymore. So all you want to do is, if we take React as an example, all you want to do is write a GraphQL query for a component and say that's like a profile screen for a user. So you say, okay, I need like the name of the user, maybe I need the last 5 followers of the user, and maybe the last 5 posts that the user created. So this kind of information you want to specify in a GraphQL query that you then send, or that gets sent over to the server by the GraphQL client. So the GraphQL client will actually abstract away this networking logic. it will construct the HTTP request for you under the hood, and then also take care of the parsing of the data. And then eventually, and that's how Apollo and Relay are both doing it, they will inject the data into the props of your component, so that all the work that you actually have to do for data fetching now is writing a query, which is very, very logical, because at some point in the data fetching process, you will have to declare your data requirements anyways. And with REST, this happens in the URL of the endpoint that you want to access. With GraphQL, it just happens in this query. And then you hand this query over to the Apollo framework, and Apollo will construct the HTTP request, parse the data, and then you, as the React developer, the next thing you have to do, you only have to worry about how you want to use this data inside the props of your component now. So you don't have to worry about putting it into Redux anymore. You don't have to write your selectors for your Redux store to get the data out again. All this is handled by Apollo, and Apollo is going to maintain like the cache for you, so that you can actually have this nice experience of a very clean and declarative data fetching approach in your application.
So for someone kind of getting started with GraphQL and GraphCool, would you recommend them to use like a client? And is Apollo like the only client that's out there?
Yeah, so it depends on which platform you're looking at. So if you're on the web, then you have the choice between Relay and Apollo, and Relay is the homegrown GraphQL client from Facebook, as I said, and then Apollo is kind of this new project that is actually built by the Meteor development group. So I think they started the Apollo project like a year or maybe 1.5 years ago. And the reason why they started Apollo was actually that if you wanted to start using GraphQL with Relay, Relay is actually quite a complicated framework to get into and to understand. So they started out to build an easy to understand GraphQL client that provides a more intuitive API than you get with Relay. Relay has its advantages as well. So actually Relay is just like really, really heavily optimized for performance. But the API to use Relay on the front end is actually somewhat cumbersome to use and not really intuitive in the first place. So if you're just starting out, I would definitely recommend you with Apollo, because there it's much clearer also, like the line between what is actually GraphQL and what is Relay. This is very hard to understand if you're just starting out with GraphQL in general. You don't know if you're writing this particular piece of code now for Relay or for GraphQL. And with Apollo, it's a lot clearer, and like you have a better intuition of what kind of data you can expect and what's happening to the local Apollo store that effectively represents your cache after you performed a mutation or something like this. So if you're just starting out, then Apollo is a much, much safer choice.
I too have noticed that Apollo is a lot easier to work with personally, but that's because I've had limited experience with Relay, and I'm more centered around like products, and getting up and running with products than I am with, I guess I don't have the time to invest in learning, something like Relay when right. Apollo makes it so much easier for me to get the ball rolling.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And like the situation has changed a little bit with Relay Modern being released, which is like the 1.0 version of Relay. So Relay Classic was even harder to understand. They kind of changed a couple of things in Relay Modern, made it easier to work with, but it's still like a complex framework that does require some time until you really understand all its bits and pieces. And also, Facebook isn't doing the best job with documentation on Relay, and real-world code examples are also pretty rare. So oftentimes when you're running into an issue with Relay, the only thing that you can do really is to dig into the code and try to understand how everything works by yourself. And this is not really the best developer experience. So there, Apollo is doing a much better job providing a nice API, providing good documentation, a lot of code samples, so that you have a good understanding of the overall system, and it's much easier to get started with.
So for people listening, this is React Native Radio. Like, what specifically makes this kind of good to use with React Native? I know we kind of mentioned that, it's good for mobile. We also mentioned Apollo. So I believe Apollo, or I don't believe, I know for sure, Apollo has like a React Native implementation or a React implementation that also works with React Native. That's pretty nice to use. But can you kind of talk about using GraphCool in general and GraphQL with React Native and any resources that are out there?
Right. So I think in general, GraphQL works really nicely with React Native and React. And the whole reason for that is essentially the programming model of React. As React has this idea of a declarative user interface. So you use React to write your user interfaces in a declarative way. And now you also get the additional component of the declarative data fetching. So that's one reason why these two go very well together, as they combine this declarative approach, and it's a really nice experience when you only have to define your data requirements in terms of the query, and the next thing you have to do is use the data inside your components, and you don't have to think about all this data fetching that you used to have to do before. And now that's just completely abstracted away. So that's just a very nice experience in general. One note maybe about GraphCool in general is that we not only provide you the CRUD style API for the data model types that you build in the first place, because we do acknowledge that there are a lot of more use cases out there that you can't really cover when you essentially only have like a layer on top of the database that allows you to do these kind of CRUD operations. So if you want to have any kind of custom functionality with GraphCool, the way how you can implement this is using serverless functions. And we really have put a lot of effort into this feature, and we allow you to write your GraphQL functions right in the GraphCool console, which is where you manage your GraphCool projects. So we have like a test system set up for you, so you can test and run your functions right in the GraphCool console. So if you have any kind of custom business logic that you need for your application, you can always drop out of the functionality that we provide and implement everything yourself just using serverless functions. Here we also acknowledge the fact that you might have like custom requirements for your applications. And in terms of the resources, there are like a couple of resources. I think even on the React Native Express website, there is a GraphQL example. If you, for example, look into the Expo documentation, there also is an example of how you get started with GraphQL and Expo. And now I actually wanted to save this for my pick, but you could also go to the How to GraphQL website, which is just a full stack tutorial website with a lot of different tutorial tracks that will essentially teach you how to use GraphQL either on the front end or on the back end with the technology of your choice. And so at the moment, we've got front end tracks for React and Apollo and React and Relay, but we're actually going to add the Expo and Apollo track really soon. So there you'll also find more information about like how these technologies precisely go together.
Okay, that's great. That's really interesting info. And I know that. What was the name of that website you mentioned? That's kind of a new website, right?
How to GraphQL. Yeah. We actually built this at GraphCool. That's what I spend my time most with for the last 4 to 5 weeks, I would say. I was really working on that full time, but we had like a really great team of contributors from the GraphQL community that were able to write these different tutorial tracks. So we had contributors that were contributing the Ruby track, the GraphQL server track, and then more just like information all around GraphQL. And that's all just provided by a really great set of contributors. It was a really nice experience to work together with all of them.
Very cool. Very cool. It's been really great having you on. I think we'll go ahead and jump to the picks now. Peter, do you have any picks?
My pick for this week is the new ReasonML website. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at that, I've been a huge fan of using Reason in my free time, and the community has been insanely helpful. And the biggest thing that you'll see now is like the ReasonML website is much more than just like the documentation. There's a whole ton of resources, guides, tutorials, and a slew of information to make your life a little easier.
All right, very cool.
Cool. Yeah, I didn't know about that. I just checked it out. It looks really nice.
So I can go next. My pick would have been How to GraphQL, but now I just talked about it. So I'll pick a different one, and that is GraphQL Talks, which is essentially a collection of all the interesting talks all around GraphQL that are happening on meetups and conferences. And you can find that on the domain graph.cool/talks. And there we provide this collection of all kinds of interesting content all around GraphQL, and especially with respect to talks that are given at conferences and meetups.
Awesome. I haven't heard that yet, so good to hear that. Good to learn about that resource. I guess I have two picks. The first one is a book, and it's called The End of Alchemy. I'm not sure if I've picked this book yet. I don't think I have, because I just recently have been picking it up and starting reading it about this month, or within the last month. But it's about the history of banking and how kind of the recent financial crisis back a few years ago, how that kind of came about, and kind of what the future looks like in banking. And it kind of is a really lightweight introduction to kind of how the banking system works in depth. So it's a really good book. I recommend checking it out. My second pick is the Chain React conference that we just kind of wrapped up. We were in Portland for a couple of days, and it was put on by Infinite Red. And it was actually one of the better conferences I've ever been to. And this is their first conference. So it was really, really amazing. And I recommend checking out the talks. And also, if you have an opportunity to go next year, it is just a fantastic conference. Portland was amazing. I've never been there before, so it was really nice kind of going there and meeting everyone and eating a lot of good food. So, so Chain React. All right. I think we'll go ahead and wrap up episode 70. Nikolas, thanks for coming on. We really enjoyed talking to you about GraphCool. And we look forward to seeing kind of what you all are going to be doing in the future.
All right. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks so much. What a great episode.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for listening. We'll see everyone next week.